Okay, welcome. We'll get this meeting started. Sorry we're a little bit late starting. Wanted to make sure it was available on the internet as well. So if you don't live in our world, the state engineer Kent Jones retired last month. My name is Boyd Clayton. I'm currently serving at the pleasure of the governor as interim state engineer until a new state engineer is appointed. And so we welcome you to this meeting. Appreciate you accepting the invitation and come and start living and understanding some things that we've been studying. The reason we're having this meeting is, as you know, in the Utah Lake Jordan River drainage, we're currently working vigorously to complete a general adjudication. One of the things that we've come to recognize as we're working through the basin is that we operate several distribution systems in silos in this basin, independent of one another. And one of the intended purposes of a general adjudication is to bring together all the rights in the basin so that they're all on the same basis of priority. That has good and bad benefits, especially if you've been operating in silos. Trying to figure out how not to break what's working is one of the things that we've been concerned about. And so we've been looking at data, and Jared Manning has prepared a presentation to try to help you understand how parts of this system are working and how we think it works. And we're not going to make any decisions today or in the very near future, but we want you to start to understand what we think we understand, and if we don't understand it right, we're looking for input and help as we move forward and try to figure out how this all works together. So unless there's any other questions, I'll just turn the time over to Jared and he'll start to help you understand this.
Okay, as I go through here, I've got several slides, and then I want to show some things on our website that I want to go over, so hopefully you can see the screens. I've got a screen right in front of me that I can see fine, so if you can't see, you can come stand up next to me and have a good seat. Couple things, I do want this to be a discussion. There are 3 or 4 or 5 times throughout here where I'm going to stop and ask for questions and comments. We've got microphones out here. I've got 3 microphones, and so we want to make sure that people are heard. This is being recorded. It's being live streamed online as well, and so if you'll raise your hands, we'll get you the microphone, and then we'll make sure that everyone can hear what's being said. Okay, so the issues we're addressing, and Boyd touched on this already, you know, we've got this adjudication going on, and we're trying to look at the entire basin, the Jordan River and Utah Lake Basin as a whole. But there have been things going on for quite a long time that have also prompted this meeting and us looking at it. One thing is, for a long time, lower Jordan River water users they've been concerned about changes to Utah Lake water rights. That really got seriously underway in about the late 80s, early 90s. Utah Lake water rights started to change a lot to underground wells in Utah County, and the concern from the lower Jordan River users was, if you take land out of production here, that return flow is not going to come down to us. And we're not going to have as much water as we've historically had. And so what we've always said is, well, if you can demonstrate that you're being impaired, then you've got to call on Utah Lake. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold. But we haven't really ever quantified what it means to be impaired down there. And so that's sort of one of the things we want to get at. There's a couple water rights on the upper Jordan River that have been a challenge to administrate, and I think they've been done different ways over the years. We want to codify how that should be done under the priority system. We've also had concerns that Utah Lake water be used efficiently, and usually that's been expressed by folks who own water on the tributaries. Particularly the Bureau of Reclamation, they've got these projects that depend on the flow on the tributaries, but their ability to store is tied to the level of Utah Lake. And so their concern is, are we using the water out of Utah Lake as efficiently as we can? Because if we're not, that's going to affect their ability to operate their water rights and their projects. So that's another thing we want to look at. Conveyance losses. This is something that we kind of punted on in the proposed determination that we did back in the 70s. We said, we told the court, we're going to look at this, do a study, and come back and make a recommendation to the court. We haven't done that yet, but it's something that we'll need to do in this adjudication process. So that's another thing we want to look at. We've had a recent request for environmental flows on the Jordan River, and this has actually happened for the past 2 years. In 2018, Water Quality was conducting a study of dissolved oxygen levels on the lower Jordan, and they wanted to send a pulse of water down to see how dissolved oxygen was going to be affected. And they were able to secure some water rights to do that. The problem was the water rights that they secured were out of priority when they needed to use that. And what we really realized as we went through that process is it's really not defined that well exactly how some of these lower Jordan water rights fit together in the priority system. We received a request this year as well for environmental flows to get water from the Jordan River out to the Great Salt Lake, again using I think the same water rights, and we sort of put up some red flags and said there's various issues, but one of them is the water rights and how to know when they are in priority so that they can be exercised. So that's another issue. The last one on there is the one that I mentioned first and that Boyd mentioned as well. All right, here's just a little simple schematic of the Jordan River. I've got Utah Lake at the top. I know it's south, but one of the first things I learned when I started working in distribution is that if you're going to draw a schematic, water has to flow downhill on the page. And so if I would have had north up, we'd have water flowing uphill, and that wouldn't work. So you'll have to orient yourself. We've got Utah Lake at the top, and then I've got the various canals that take water, and then I've got inflows. One thing we'll be talking about is wastewater, sewage effluent, and the supply that it is for the Jordan River, and we'll try and quantify that and talk about some of the effects of that. So I've got those on there. A few gauges on here that are important that you should know about. When the surplus canal splits, there's USGS gauges here on both sides, the Jordan River side and the surplus canal side. And then as you get down the surplus canal, excess water goes out to the Goggin drain, and so there's a gauge there. So these are the three main gauges we will be talking about. We'll be looking at hydrographs and different things, so it's important to know what's being represented when we show those hydrographs. We've got some of these wastewater treatment plants. Salt Lake City's actually does not contribute. It doesn't go back to the Jordan River. It goes, it kind of goes through the duck clubs and straight out to the Great Salt Lake. I understand that treatment plant is being, what's the word? Rebuilt. But I put that on there for your information, as well as Magna's wastewater treatment plant, which doesn't contribute to the hydrology here, but they're important to know because wastewater treatment and sewage effluent is an important source of the water that's used in this valley. Couple things I want to talk about. First is the Snow Decree of 1967. This was a court case, and it involved North Jordan, the North Jordan Canal. Actually, it was the North Jordan Irrigation Company. Kennecott acquired a portion of that water right, filed a change application to take what was irrigation water out to Magna for processing, and the Lower Jordan users, they protested and said, hey, there was return flow when it was irrigation. If you take it out and use it for mining, we're not going to have that return flow, and we're going to be impacted. That got litigated, and eventually the parties came to a stipulation, and the stipulation said, okay, we're going to look at the supply in the river at these two gauges, the Jordan River and the Surplus Canal. When it drops below 325 second feet, at that point, then we know the Lower Jordan River users are being shorted water, and Kennecott is going to have to leave some water in the stream to make up for the return flow that would have gone to them. So this is a real important case because it gives us a quantity for these water rights, and you'll see why that's important when I show the paper water rights later. To have this quantity to help us operate is real important, but it only applies to the irrigation season. So we've got the non-irrigation season where we don't have a snow decree to sort of give us some guidelines, but keep this in mind because this is one of the parameters that we need to operate under as we administer water. So again, the parameter is that as we get below 325 second feet on the Lower Jordan, then there is a shortage occurring. Whether it's in priority or not is a different story. Yeah.
Hey, Jared, sorry to interrupt you.
And before you answer or ask, let me get your microphone here.
Again, sorry to interrupt. Just for my notes, does this snow decree / Kennecott right, does it have a priority date assigned to it? Just for my notes.
Yeah, it does. The original, and I'll actually show this later, but I think it's like an 1852 is the North Jordan right. The change application I think was filed in 1966. So, all right. Next thing that we have currently existing is a Utah Lake distribution plan. Now that covers Utah Lake and the Provo River basically, but it also covers the diversion of the storage water from Utah Lake to those canals that I have circled there, and so that is also another parameter that we need to work within as we look at these systems as a whole. Utah Lake water rights are defined primary and secondary, and then there are other storage water rights on the Provo River, which I'll call tertiary. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. What our purpose is for this meeting and going forward is to come up with a Jordan River plan. So we've got these parameters already, the snow decree, the Utah Lake plan, but we don't have something that sort of covers all of it. And we've got a separate Lower Jordan River distribution system, and that's separate from the Utah Lake distribution system. We've also got a Little Cottonwood distribution system, and then there are a bunch of other tributaries that we don't have distribution systems on. Typically, that's because the water rights are controlled by, or mostly controlled by a single entity. But we're going to try and look at the whole thing, including the tributaries, and see if we can fit those together somehow. So, any other questions or comments here before I go forward? Okay, we got a mic coming to you.
Can I ask why you don't have Draper irrigation or up there?
Yeah, I've just got the East Jordan Canal. I was just trying to make it simple, but of course, then Draper Irrigation takes off the East Jordan Canal. And then you also have Salt Lake City who takes off the East Jordan Canal. So it wasn't because we wanted to leave you out, it was just because I was keeping it as simple as I could.
This is John Maybe. Jared, do you have a copy of the snow decree that's available? Will it be posted online?
Yes, we do. I'll be showing a model here that we've got online. One of the pages on the model, I've got a bunch of different links to important documents. Among those are the snow decree, proposed determinations, and other things. So as we get to that, I'll be sure to point that out to you.
Thank you.
Okay, and any other questions before we move forward? Okay. Basically, what I'm going to be talking about now for the rest of my time are Hydrology 1 and water rights 2. So hydrology and water rights. And usually when we have policy meetings like this, we'll commission a study, like with the USGS, they'll come do a publication on the hydrology or the hydrogeology, and we'll present that to the public. This system is actually pretty easy, and it didn't really warrant a study. But we have been looking at the hydrology. There are several important things that we want to point out to you, get you thinking about, so that you can understand sort of, so that we're all understanding, I guess, the same thing. What this graph shows, and we've only got data going back to 1943, which is when the USGS gauges were put on the lower Jordan River and the Surplus Canal. It shows the total flow from 1943 up through this year. You'll notice that the slope of that line goes upward, and we'll be talking about why that is in the next couple of slides. But if you look real carefully at about the last 30 years, or so, after the big floods of the 80s, that line is actually pretty flat. So it goes up for decades. I think if we had data back to the 30s, it would be even lower, because we know the 30s were a drought time. So it goes up from the 30s all the way up through the 80s, and then from the 90s up through here, it's flat. And so part of what I'll want you to do as your homework is to look into your crystal balls and figure out what this is going to look like in the future, because that's what we're planning for, is the future, and trying to develop a policy around future scenarios. Okay, so I want to maybe try and explain some of the things that have caused that graph to go up. First thing, you put in streets where there were fields. You've got hardscape now, and so you have runoff that you didn't have before. It's kind of interesting to look at the hydrographs on the lower Jordan, because they kind of look like southern Utah. They're kind of really flashy. Southern Utah is like that because they've got a lot of impermeable rock and stuff out in the watershed. Well, we've got that in the form of roads and rooftops and stuff as well. And so that's part of where the increase comes from. Another place is municipal underground use. As you take water from the underground and you take it out of storage and you send it to homes and then through a treatment plant, it gets into the river. And so there's an increase as we develop that source. Also, if there is irrigation use that you change to municipal use, that's a reduced depletion. I think most of us are familiar with that concept. That puts more water in the system, through the treatment plants. And the other thing I've got on there is increased imports. Imports have been occurring in this basin since the early 1900s. It started with the strawberry project, and then in the 40s, I think we started bringing water from the Weber River, and in the 50s, the Duchesne Tunnel was built. We started bringing water from there, And then in the late 80s, early 90s, we started bringing more water as well from Strawberry. And so part of that increase that we saw in that last graph is due to increased imports that occurred over that time period. This isn't a one-way street, though, with urbanization. Although urbanization does cause increased surface water outflow, there are things that will offset that. And I think that's what we saw in those first decades from the 30s to the 80s. I think what we saw was that the increases were far in excess of the decreases. Once we got into the last 30 years or so, those things have offset themselves, and so it's been a flat line. But let's talk about a few of those things. When you develop water in non-tributary areas where the return flow doesn't come back into the system, Cedar Valley's one example. If say Provo River water gets taken out there, depending on where the treatment plant discharges, it may not come back into the system. I talked about some of those treatment plants, Salt Lake City's and Magna's. Some of that water, you know, it goes back to the Great Salt Lake, but it's not going back to the Lower Jordan to help supply some of those water rights. So non-tributary areas, if you develop non-irrigated lands, it's nice if you take irrigated lands out of production and from a water standpoint and put in homes because you get an increased supply. But if you've got non-irrigated lands, you actually have a decreased supply from that. Increased underground use. I actually had this on the other slide as well, but it depends what's happening here. If you're removing the water from storage and putting it in the river, that will tend to increase the flows. But at some point, you're going to start removing water. Even though you're pumping it, it's going to affect the water that flows out to the river, and so you're going to decrease it. And so there's a balance there. And I would think, for instance, there are planned well fields for shallow wells along the Jordan River. I would think that once those get developed, that they would start to decrease the water that flows out to the Jordan River. But a lot of these main wells are taking water from storage, and so it actually ends up being an increase. New surface water development. I actually think this is what has caused the graph to flatten out in the last 30 years. Jordanelle came on in the early 90s, and that developed, I think, is it like 90,000 acre feet or so? That's a round number of what Jordanelle delivers on contracts. So that's a significant amount. I don't think 90,000 acre feet is being delivered every year yet, but I think we're probably getting close. We're probably 75 to 80,000 acre feet or so in the last decade, and I think in 2018 we were getting pretty close to that 90,000. So there may still be a little bit more surface water development as we get to that full amount, but I think that was been the main offset. Now, some of that water is replaced by water that comes over from Strawberry, but you know, so the whole 90,000 wasn't new development. As I said, some was exchange, but some of it was new development. So this is really where we need to look into our crystal ball and say, what does this mean? Oh, I should hit on that last one, sewage effluent reuse. I don't think this is occurring, at least not on a great scale right now in the basin, but I know there are plans to do that. It's been talked about for a long time. If sewage effluent starts being reused heavily, that will increase or it will decrease the water available in the Lower Jordan. So what's going to happen in the next 30 years? I'm not sure, but these are the things that we ought to be thinking about. I know, for instance, that there's going to be more water being imported through the Bonneville unit, another 60,000 acre feet of water. But I also know that there's lands being developed on western part of Salt Lake Valley and Cedar Valley And we've got these sewage effluent projects being planned. But we also have irrigated land in, southern Utah County that's going to be converted. So I don't know how the balance is going to all come out, but I guess there's a chance that we could see that curve that is flattened out start to decrease. If I had to guess, I would think that it would start to increase again, but my crystal ball is as good as yours. This is another place where maybe I'm going to stop and take questions or comments. Anybody have any questions or comments? Sure. Oh, let's go here first because we got the microphone, then we'll go there.
Garrett, on your graph showing the hydrograph of the lower Jordan River, where is the gauge? Where's the defining point of lower Jordan River?
It's the combination of those two gauges that I showed on that schematic, and it's down just close to 2100 south in Salt Lake when it breaks off, and those both those gauges are, I don't know, a quarter mile or something downstream from where that split occurs. Okay.
Sorry, turn it on. Hi, I'm Soren Simonson, the Executive Director of the Jordan River Commission. And a quick question. It looks like this is primarily focusing on the lower Jordan River. Is that correct? Or is the entire Jordan River kind of in consideration? And the reason that I ask is I have occasion to paddle the river pretty regularly with my job duties and responsibilities. And over the year, I've paddled the entire river a couple of times, and the flows around the point of the mountain in Bluffdale are almost non-existent during times of the year. I paddled in June and again in September. And with all that's happening with point of the mountain development, the prison relocation and revitalization of that site happening very near the Jordan River, where the river is kind of a central feature for recreation and fishing and other things. I think that there is the potential for impairment, but also as a recreation asset, there's a real significant lack of water in that area as well. So I'm just curious if there is consideration for the entire Jordan River, or if this is really just initially focusing on the lower.
I think we're considering the entire Jordan River. A lot of what I'm going to present is going to be focused on the lower Jordan, and really that's because we've sort of hit the upper Jordan with our Utah Lake management plan, and so we have a pretty good idea how that's being managed. The lower Jordan is something that we haven't looked at as closely. So, but it is, we do want to look at the entire Jordan River and the tributaries as well as part of this process. Okay, any other questions or comments before I move forward? Okay, I mentioned I was going to be going over hydrology, and it's a fairly simple hydrology, but what I wanted to do was get an idea of what the inflows and outflows were to the Jordan River system. Jordan River system doesn't have any storage, and so the inflows equals the outflows. So it's a pretty simple analysis to make. I looked at the year 2018. It was an easy year to look at, mostly because it was pretty dry. And so sometimes when you get a lot of storms, it can make the hydrology a little ambiguous. But I looked at the winter and the summer because it's apparent when you look at the hydrographs that the summer flow is higher than the winter flow. And part of what I want to do is quantify what that difference is and explain why that is, so that you can consider that as we move forward. So in the winter, we're showing that the total flow in those months, November to February of 2018, was about 267 second feet. The total flow in the summer was about 378 second feet, so it's increased by over 100 second feet. As you look at that, the amount coming from wastewater treatment plants, sewage effluent, is a pretty good chunk. It's not quite half. In the winter, it's about 45%, and then in the summer, it's about a third. The base flow is the other big chunk, and by base flow, I just mean the natural underground contribution to the Jordan River. There's just a natural flow. The Jordan River is a gaining stream throughout the valley, and so the base flow is what it gains from groundwater. You also see I've got some storm runoff. It was easy just to look at the peaks of the hydrograph and quantify that and average it over the time period. That top line up there, Utah County River Make, I was really looking, as I did this analysis, I was looking from Joint Dam down to the Lower Jordan. So just to refresh your memory, you got Utah Lake Dam, it goes down through the Jordan Narrows, you got Turner Dam, and then you've got Joint Dam. And so I'm looking at from Joint Dam all the way down. But during the winter, there is some make between Utah Lake and Joint Dam, and so I had to include that in as part of my analysis. So this is the inflow. We're going to look at the outflow on the next slide. Keep in mind that there's no storage, so the inflow equals the outflow. Let's see. Somehow I skipped my inflows and I had to back up to get to my outflows. Yep. So here's the outflows. Same quantities, 267 second feet in the winter, 378 in the summer, and you can see how we calculated that. It's just the sum of the diversions. There's these two gauges here, the surplus canal diversion, that's the USGS gauge, the Jordan River, that's the other USGS gauge, and then we've got there's only 3 other diversions: Riverton City, North Jordan Canal, and Brighton and North Point. Because remember, I'm going below Joint Dam, so I'm not considering the other diversions up there. Laura, can we get Laura a mic?
Sorry, I'm behind a slide, but on your inflows, where were the tributaries on that? Where were they accounted for?
It's basically counted as part of the base flow, and because what we see basically is that, you know, the water is taken up high at the mouth of the canyons, and so pretty much all that water is taken, and so there's not even really a lot of tributaries in there, but what there is, it just is part of that base flow number.
So, Ann Neville, with these graphs, you have it in CFS, and before you were talking about acre feet. Will you convert these into acre feet eventually so that we understand what actual volumes are coming into the system, or this is a rate?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I've mixed my units with acre feet and CFS. And so just to maybe explain my thinking, usually when I'm talking about a short-term rate, I'll use CFS, but if I'm talking about like an annual volume, I'll use an acre foot amount. But the way to convert, if you've got an annual acre feet amount, just divide by 724, that'll give you second feet. If you've got a daily second foot amount, times it by 2 to get the acre feet per day. But yeah, sorry about that. That's just, it's not consistent, but that tends to be the way that I quantify things. Whether it's the right way or not, I don't know. But any other questions on that? All right, went over that one in reverse order. I wanted to throw this slide in here just to give some quantities as far as what was being contributed by the wastewater treatment plants. And so I've got those listed there basically from the top of the system down. And so there's a significant amount. As you saw from the other slides, it's from about 45% in the winter to about a third in the summer of the supply of the river comes from sewage effluent. And that does not include the amounts that do not go into the river, but that go out to the Great Salt Lake. However, I have included them on here for informational purposes. Couple other things I should point out as far as wastewater effluent. The South Davis Sewer District South Plant, that water is not naturally tributary to the Jordan River. It's more of an import, and that goes into the Jordan River and gets used by the duck clubs. And that's the same thing with the South Davis North Plant. That's also not naturally tributary to the Utah Lake Jordan River drainage. It comes from Davis County, and that water doesn't go into the Jordan River. Wildlife has a water right for that, and it goes directly out to their waterfowl management area in Farmington Bay. All right, more hydrology. Hang with me because it gets worse. No, it doesn't really. I wanted to quantify Utah Lake deliveries to Salt Lake Valley. And the reason why is because I talked about that 100 to 110 second foot difference of flow in the summer compared to the winter. Well, I'm going to attempt to explain why that is. And in order to know that, we need to understand that there's a lot of Utah Lake water during the summer that gets diverted into several canals in the Salt Lake Valley. And so I've listed them basically from the top of the system down. Utah Lake Distributing Canal, 37 second feet. Welby Jacob, 30. I can never remember which one's the Welby and which one's the Jacob. But one of them goes south, one of them goes north. I just hedged my bet and called it the Welby Jacob. Utah and Salt Lake Canal, 109 second feet. That includes water used for irrigation and mining. I've got that broken down. East Jordan Canal. See, I didn't forget Draper Irrigation Company. They're in there, as well as the Canal Company and Salt Lake City. And I think the commissioner also assigns like a 10% conveyance loss on that water. South Jordan Canal, Jordan and Salt Lake Canal. You can see it's a significant amount of water. It's about 383 second feet. And again, I was looking to be consistent at July through September of 2018. So this, as we go to the next slides, it'll help. Well, let me go back before I get to that one and talk a little bit about the challenges of managing water in an urbanizing environment. It's different than it used to be, and I think what we see is one of the challenges is that water is taken on demand rather than according to a turn schedule. When you got a canal and you share it with a few major users, you tend to have a turn schedule, and everyone takes the full supply for a certain amount of time, and you rotate it through. As you urbanize and you get a whole bunch of little users, they take it on demand rather than on a turn schedule. And so rather than being able to use a consistent amount through the canal, you have a demand that fluctuates like that. And you see that throughout the state whenever you urbanize. That makes it tough to be efficient with the water because you're always trying to meet those peaks. And because if not, people are squawking and you're running out of water. Well, what does that mean when you don't have that demand? It means there's excess water in the system that'll spill out and go back to the system. And so that's part of why we have a a higher flow in the summer is because of the challenges of distributing the water in these canals. And some of it has to do with that demand. Question here, you got Mike.
So I guess I'm a little confused on the numbers over here. So is this a daily average from July through September, or is that the average
That,
July through September?
that's the daily average. Or, well, I mean, CFS is just a point in time, but yeah, that's the average flow over that time period. Yep. Maybe I should have converted it to acre feet.
Yeah, I asked John if he thinks that's real.
If he thinks what's real.
Those numbers, since he distributes it.
Well, I got these numbers from John's report, so I agree with him. So presumably he thinks they're real. All right. Well, let me, before I get to that slide, let me back up again, and what I'm showing on this slide that I'm about to get to is this 115 second feet. This is inflow in the summer that I'm calling Utah Lake / return flows. It's water that's not there in the winter. It's there because in the summer because we're running water through these canals and it's coming back into the system. The other way it gets in there is rather than if you run it through the canals, if you run it past Joint Dam, it'll also be in the system. So 2 ways to get Utah Lake water really into the system. You just run it straight down the river or you run it out to the canals and it comes back. And so this 115 second feet is what I want to address here. You can tell that's happening because we've got gauges on some of these tributaries, and you can look at the flows jump up, or you can look at the canyon mouth, and then you can look farther downstream and see that they increase, and so you can figure out how much water that was in canals is actually ending up in these creeks. And so the ones that we've got gauges on, we're able to quantify. Big Cottonwood, Little Cottonwood, Mill Creek, Midas Creek, Bingham Creek. But we need to account for 115 second feet. And so on the measured inflows, we can only account for that much. So there's another 64 second feet of unmeasured inflow that's occurring either as water going past Joint Dam or as water that gets diverted into the canals and then comes back into the river at some point. All right, so, yeah.
Go back to your last slide.
Sure.
I guess I don't understand your title says Utah Lake contributions to Jordan River. So is the unmeasured flow what's coming out of Utah Lake, or?
So
Is
it's
this-
water that goes into the canals and is not used either because there's a fluctuating demand curve and it's that overflow, or because the shareholder doesn't have the use for it. He's getting delivered the water, but he's not using it, and so it goes back into the system. But it originated in Utah Lake. If it had not been sent from Utah Lake out through that canal, it wouldn't be in the Jordan River.
I think she's confused because you have creeks listed on there, and you're just demonstrating that that's the additional flow that makes it to those creeks, then makes it to, that's measurable in those creeks.
Right,
Because none of these go into Utah Lake.
right, but they come from Utah Lake. And that's what I'm showing. I mean, because that's where the canals, they come out of Utah Lake, and then they go out along the benches and through the canal. And so the water that doesn't get used in the canals comes back into the creeks, or it comes back in other places where we don't have measurements. Storm drain systems, for instance, would be a big place how that water gets back to the river. So, okay. And this is an important concept to understand, because I think when interests that are tributary to Utah Lake, the Bureau, for instance, says, hey, we want to make sure water is being used efficiently, we can at least point to some water and have a decent quantification of how much is not being used that returns back. The important thing to remember as well is that that return flow helps make up the water supply of the lower Jordan River. And so that leads me right into my next slide. What would happen, first of all, what are some of the things you could do if the goal was to reduce that Utah Lake water that went out to the lower Jordan? There's some things that you can do that are probably pretty expensive, like a pressurized system. Other areas of the state have put regulating ponds. You'd have to have massive regulating ponds for the size of these canals. I don't know how manageable that would be. I talked about a turn schedule, but that's tough when you've got on-demand users rather than irrigators. This fourth one down here is one that probably has some merit, and that is to deliver to the laterals based on actual acres. As I've gone out, and I've gone out to almost all these canals and talked with canal company presidents and water masters and tried to understand how they were delivering the water, all of them say, man, we're delivering this just as tight as we can. We're not wasting any water. And I think that's true. They are managing the main canal for the most part, though, and sometimes they will deliver it to a lateral that may have, say, 400 shares. I know I got 400 shares on this lateral. I'm going to deliver them that water, and then it gets managed privately after that. And so I think my guess is that what you have is shareholders who are getting delivered water who may not have a full use for it anymore. And so from the main canal's perspective, they're just delivering it as tightly as possible. But if you were to look at some of the laterals, I think you would probably see that the use isn't there like it used to be, and that's helping to account for some of the water that's coming back to the Jordan River. The other thing I've got on here is conveyance losses, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But that's part of the challenge is that the commissioner faces is, okay, I know how many shares are in the canal. Is there some conveyance loss that I need to add in there as well? Questions at this point or further comments before I move on?
Shane Jones with Provo City. Jared, I'm just trying to tie in my mind the beginning discussion about the concerns that we have on the drainage and tying disparate drainages together, and the focus on just the Jordan River, because the Utah Lake Management Plan kind of ties in Utah Lake and tributaries to Utah Lake, but ultimately what we're talking about in maximizing the water that's left in Utah Lake is management of water that comes into Utah Lake. You mentioned the concerns that the Bureau has with their storage projects and other things like that. So is this plan just limited to the Jordan River, or are we talking about the whole tributary area?
I think that for this plan, we are talking about the Jordan River. But as Boyd mentioned, we're doing a comprehensive general adjudication that will touch the entire drainage. And so at some point, we may be looking at some of these drainages that are tributary to Utah Lake to also fit them into here. One thing I did on this meeting is I sent out invites to people on our Provo River system and our Spanish Fork system, and I was a little torn on whether I should do that since we were talking mainly about the Jordan River. But I wanted them to be aware that we were doing something on their drainage that they may be interested in. And at some later time, we may start to look upstream and tie it all together. And so if you're upstream of Utah Lake and you're wondering how this ties in to your water rights, it's not quite as directly as the other folks. But I wanted people to be aware of what we were doing and invite them to participate, so they didn't say, hey, you know, what are you doing on our system? This could potentially have an effect on us. So I hope I answered that all right. Any other questions? Okay, right here, we got a microphone, Ben. Right behind you.
Hi, Soren Simonson again with the Jordan River Commission. I'm curious how the timing of this and kind of the focus ties in with other legislative activities that are going on. I'm thinking specifically the water banking legislation, which Senator Iwamoto and Representative Hawks have been working on, and the Watershed Council Act across the state, which Representative Hawks has drafted some legislation about. Does this dovetail somehow with that? Is that part of the timing of this, or is it just coincidental?
I think it's probably coincidental, but of course we're aware of like the water banking things that are going on, and I did send out an invite to Senator Iwamoto. I don't see her here. I know she's very busy and she represents folks in this district, but it's a good point. There are other things going on that we need to start thinking about, and so as we consider what I'm presenting, we need to consider these other things that are going on as well. So good point. Thanks for that. Okay, any other comments before I move on? Okay, I think I've got one more slide before I go to our web page. Talked about conveyance losses already. What we told the court in the 70s was, hey, canals that are longer than a mile in length, we're going to determine what the conveyance losses are and submit that to the court. In the 80s, we commissioned a study to go look at that. The USGS looked at that, and they did some, they quantified what they thought the conveyance losses were in the canals. As I've talked to water users, commissioners, water masters, and things who have experience, people don't seem to be very confident in what the numbers are that the USGS came up with. This may be because conditions are just different now than they were. I think the actual measurements were done in 82 and 83. But the groundwater table has changed, and so I don't have a lot of confidence because the water users who know what they're talking about and the commissioners who know what they're talking about don't have a lot of confidence. But at any rate, that study's out there. We've never acted on it as far as proposing something to the court to quantify those. But I think that is something that we want to do, that we have committed to doing as part of this adjudication. The approach that we've kind of discussed internally is going out to the water users and saying, all right, water users, you tell us what your conveyance losses are. Submit a claim on that and do it that way rather than us going out and trying to figure out what it is. I guess maybe stay tuned on that. At some point, we may be doing that, soliciting a water user's claim to quantify those conveyance losses. But just as far as definition here, conveyance losses really means seepage and evaporation from the canal. If there is flow-through water that returns back to the system, I think we would consider that to be an inefficiency. It may not be an inefficiency that's easy to avoid, but I don't think we would consider that to be a conveyance loss. I think conveyance loss is loss consists of seepage and evaporation. So just wanted to point that out. A lot of times I hear this word carrier water, which I still don't know what it really means, but I think what it really means is I need enough water in my canal to run it the way I've always run it. And whatever the difference is between what you say I have and what I think I need, I'm going to call carrier water. So that's not a very scientific explanation, and that's why it kind of drives me crazy, but whatever. All right. Any questions on this, on conveyance losses, before I move on? Okay, good. And shoot, you know what? I lied. I had one more slide. And it reminded me, because I brought up the webpage that was supposed to be my lead in to what I was showing on the webpage. But these are the water rights from Utah Lake. I mentioned that since the late 80s, early 90s, there's been a lot of water that's been moved out of these canals. And so you'll see here in this first column, I've got the total acres that was originally in the canal. And that totals up to be about 41,000 acres. Some of that water has been moved out. That's what's in this column. By moved out, I mean moved to a well, or they've mostly been moved to wells. Some of the water has been transferred internally, basically from one canal to another. That's what these next two columns represent, water that was either transferred to Welby-Jacob water users or water that was transferred to Salt Lake City. So since those are just internal transfers, it doesn't affect our remaining acres. But if you take our total acres, subtract out what's been moved out, this is what on paper is remaining in the canals, about 27,000. So almost exactly a third of the water has been moved out on paper. I think if you look at aerial photos, historical aerial photos, look at hydrographic survey maps, and then look and see cities there now, I think it's pretty easy to conclude that there's been more than a third of the water, at least of the land, that's been taken out of production. And that's simply because people still hold on to those shares, and they haven't been changed yet. And so there's a fair amount of water that's not being used. People own the shares, and I think are probably being delivered that water by the canals. So this is going to transition me into our website, because I'm going to show our company page, our water company page, where I got this information. Hopefully you guys who are associated with canal companies are familiar with this, but I wanted to bring it up just in case and sort of emphasize the importance of having this data. Okay, I just brought up Utah and Salt Lake Canal Company. It's the first one that came to mind. So I apologize, Utah and Salt Lake Canal Company people that are here. I'm not picking on you. I just happened to pick this. We've got some information. Here's the irrigated acres in the canal company, and total number of shares in the company is 10,000. This is the acre foot limitation. As you come down here, we've got the share statements that have moved water out of the canal, or at least that have filed change applications. Sometimes a change application doesn't move water out of the canal. It just changes the nature of use. For instance, if a municipality changes it from irrigation to municipal use and they just want to deliver it in their secondary system, we still consider that to be water that we want to deliver. And so in this last column over here, we identify whether the water has been actually moved out of the canal or if it stays in the canal because it's just changed the use, for instance. Some of them are blank. If it's lapsed or withdrawn or something like that, it'll be blank and it will not be counted as water that is moved out of the canal. The only water that we're counting as being moved out of the canal is water that's under approved and perfected change applications that physically moves the water out rather than just changes, the use or the place of use. If you come down here, it does a nice little tally. You can see that out of 10,000 shares, just over half of them have moved out of the canal. And so there's just still about half, just under half of the shareholders who have not moved water out of the canal. That doesn't necessarily mean, as I said before, that all those shareholders are irrigating what they have historically irrigated, but at least on paper, they're still in the company and being delivered water, presumably. Any questions on this page or anything else up to this point before I move on? Okay, got a question back here. Oh.
So is the status of the original acreage based on like the last PDs that have come out, or what's the original acreage number coming from?
It's based on during the late 80s when the Welby-Jacob applications were being filed. As part of those decisions, we quantified the acres. And our quantification was based on those PDs. There may have been some slight variation for some reason or another, but I think they're the acreages that we identified in the Welby-Jacob decisions, and then we also put those in the Utah Lake Management Plan. So that's the other place you'll see them codified. Some of these still have pending objections, I think, and so these aren't written in stone. Well, no, they're written in stone. Don't get any ideas. No, I'm just kidding. All right, any other questions? All right. This is a model that we've got for Jordan River, and there's a bunch of reports on here. I'll be going through several of these, but this is available publicly on our website if you know where the models are at. Maybe I ought to just back out just a second and show you how to get there. So if we start from our home page, down to, I don't know if you saw that, distribution and regulation, let's see, distribution systems, distribution models. This one's called Jordan River Management Plan. So it's available. I encourage you to go look at it. That's where I've dumped a bunch of data. That's where I've dumped the links, for instance, to the snow decree. John had a question about that earlier. That's, while I'm thinking about it, I'll show you that right here. I've got some links. If there are other things that you think we need to put on there, we're happy to add them. But let me go up to this graph. What this graph shows is well, a bunch of stuff. In the background here, the blue line, that is the water use on the lower Jordan River. So what it is it's the sum of those two gauges that I showed on the Jordan and the surplus canal minus the Goggin drain, because that's water that's flood water. So add the two gauges, subtract the Goggin drain, and then do a little averaging, and you get that dark blue line. In the background, you can see the Goggin drain is that purplish color, and then the light blue color is the sum of the Jordan and the surplus canal. So that's the hydrograph showing actual water. The red line and the green line show the water rights on paper. And so you may say, well, which line is it? Is it the red line or is it the green line? The red line shows the CFS of the water rights on the lower Jordan all added up. You add them all up, and it's over 600 second feet, at least during the winter or during the summer. It goes up and down, and that's what that line traces, is the total flow rate of all the water rights throughout the year. The green represents the water rights as well, but what it represents is a duty amount. So these water rights are mostly at 5 feet per acre, but if you know about the lower Jordan, there are a bunch of categories that we put these into when we did the PDs back in the 70s, and there is one category that's at 4 feet per acre. But if you add up all the acres, times it by the duty, and spread it evenly across the time period, you come up with the green line below. And so you can see these lines, the red and the green line, they've got the same basic shape, but they're different magnitude. And so you look at what the actual use is, and so this is kind of a tough thing. What's the water rate? What are the users actually entitled to take? Is it the red line? Is it the green line? Is it something else? Well, I think it's something else. And that's what I'm going to show here. Remember at the very beginning, I talked about the snow decree, and I talked about the 325 second feet, how it was stipulated that at 325 second feet, that's when the lower users are being impaired. And so, but that only applies to the irrigation season. And so I've shown the 325 second feet there. But that's not the final answer. There has been water since that time that has been moved out. Mainly in 2 chunks for Jordan Valley for their shallow well program. They bought 2 chunks of water rights. And so if you subtract those water rights out, that becomes the line. And you notice the red line and the green line, I both reduced. And so, all right, now we've got lines that are a little bit closer together than they started. But again, what are the water users entitled to? I think what the water users are entitled to is this red line that we've got there that reflects the 325 second feet minus the water that's been moved out. And so now this is 2018 that I'm looking at. 2018 was a really dry year, and you see that we actually went down below that red line. But this was the time of year in the summer where water quality wanted to do their tests on dissolved oxygen. And so they had acquired later priority water rights, and they said, hey, we want to send that water down. And we said, there is no water. It already belongs to somebody. And that's because we were right in this area right here. We would need to be significantly above that line, and then that would have been the chunk of water that theoretically we could have sent down to satisfy those rights. A couple things you'll notice on here. One thing, you can see our level during the non-irrigation season is down here, and it jumps up in the irrigation season. That's that 115 second feet that I was talking about that comes from Utah Lake and goes into the canals and then comes into either storm drains or tributaries and into the Jordan River. And you can see right around, I think it was about October 15th in 2018, that's the typical date that we stopped delivering Utah Lake water, and you can see the immediate drop-off that occurs there, in the month of October. And that's because that Utah Lake water is not there anymore. let's look at another year. Let's look at 2019. And sometimes I got to click another report and then go back to make it load up the next year. So this is 2019. If I zoom out, we can see that it was a lot better year. Even though Utah Lake didn't spill, there was just a ton of water coming down the canyons and so forth. And by the time water's out of the Goggin drain, late July, we're above that red line and stay above that red line for the rest of the year. So I think there's no question that in 2019, according to the snow decree and the water rights that we know about, that there was sufficient water to fulfill those rights in 2019. We do dip below there in October, but again, that's because the water stops being delivered to the lake. But remember, the snow decree only counts during the irrigation season, and so once that water is no longer being delivered from Utah Lake, we're not in the snow decree anymore, and so that line doesn't apply anymore. Actually, it becomes this line, I guess. All right. Let me show a couple of these other reports. I've got one for Utah Lake. And the reason I've got Utah Lake here is because we're trying to look at this system as a whole, and we have some definitions for water rights in Utah Lake. We've got primary water rights. Those are the early priority water rights. And primary water rights can divert water as long as there's water that they can reach. And so if you look at this axis right here represents the capacity of Utah Lake. Our dead storage here is about 160,000. Up to here is our primary storage. So that water is set aside for the primary users. If we fall below that level, the secondary users get cut off and the primary users can divert. Now, between the primary storage and this conversion line, that's when the secondary, let me step back. The secondary water users can divert as long as it's above this primary storage line. The tertiary water users, what I'm calling tertiary water users, would be Jordanelle and Deer Creek, and they can divert when Utah Lake is above this green line. Now, I've got two green lines on there. Sometimes it's the upper line, sometimes it's the lower line, depending on what Central Utah wants to do with their Utah Lake water rights. But if we're above that green line, tertiary can divert. If we're above this salmon-colored line, secondary can divert. And if we're above this blue line, primary can divert. That's the scheme that's set up in the Utah Lake distribution plan. Now let me explain these other two lines, the blue and the blue, the darker blue and the lighter blue. That's our Utah Lake level. And that upper one, that is the natural level of Utah Lake. That's what you will go out and see as far as being physical wet water. But some of that water is import water. It's been brought over from Strawberry. It's been brought over from Duchesne Tunnel or Weber River, and it belongs to the importer. And so once you subtract that out, you get that lower line, and that's the natural level, I guess, of Utah Lake rather than the actual level. So what we really need, what you really need to look at when you look at this graph is this lower line and where it is in relation to these other lines. Okay, some of you who are familiar with Utah Lake, this is, you live and breathe this stuff. If this is new to you, it might sound real confusing, and don't worry, it'll only take 3 to 5 years before you get it down. So at least it did for me, but I'm kind of a slow learner. All right, so let me go look at 2018, and again, sometimes I gotta do some things. Yeah, let's look at a real interesting year. Let's look at 2016. Oh yeah, there we go. Notice what happens here in 2016. You look at this lower blue line, we're barely into that secondary storage. So at that point, all the primary and secondary water rights in Utah Lake can divert, but Jordanelle and Deer Creek can't because we're below that green line. They've got other ways to get water through exchanges and so forth. And so don't think that if you saw water in Jordanelle or Deer Creek in 2016 that they were doing something wrong. They weren't. They had the water rights to do it, but it was under a different scheme. Eventually, later in the summer, we get below this primary storage line, and the later priority water rights in Utah Lake had to be cut off because they weren't in priority anymore according to the Utah Lake plan. So why am I even going over all this? The reason is because, again, we're trying to look at the system as a whole and apply the same principle to the water rights on the Jordan River. So let's look at some of those. Well, first of all, I've got this report. I'm not sure how well that shows up for you, but I've color-coded our primary water rights out of Utah Lake in this blue, the secondary water rights in this salmon color, and then our tertiary water rights in this green color. I've tried to make them match these colors here. If we're a blue right, you got to be above the blue line to divert. If you're a salmon right, you got to be above the salmon line to divert. If you're a green right, you got to be above the green line to divert. So that's the purpose of the color coding on this page. And I'm going to actually carry those color codes throughout as we look at the rest of the system, because I think the same principles apply. All right, so here's our lower Jordan water rights, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to see them all here. Let's see what I can do. Yeah, if you can see all of them, you can actually see none of them. So I'm not going to zoom out anymore. But just know that there are you can scroll over and see this. I've got these are all the water rights on the lower Jordan River. They got the owner of the water right, the priority, the source. It's either on the Jordan River side or the surplus canal side, the flow rate, the period of use. But there's a whole bunch of crazy periods of use, and I've split them out over here just so that it's easier to add them up when you get to the end. So you can see, oh, here's what the total is for January 1st through January 15th, 485 second feet. These are the numbers I used to produce the graph, that first graph that you saw, the red and the green lines, the water rights. This would be the red line. Okay, it's just the CFS amounts on all those water rights. Again, I've color coded these. These blue, these correspond to our primary water rights in Utah Lake. They've got the same priority up to 1878. The primary rights in Utah Lake, the latest ones have a priority of 1878. But then the secondary water rights in Utah Lake, let me look at those again. Utah Lake. Secondary water rights have priorities between 1908 and 1911, okay? And then the tertiary is 1945 to 1971. Oh, it's 1879, I guess, is the primary. So anything 1879 or earlier is going to get that blue. That would be considered a primary right. But we've got that gap between 1879 and 1908, and I don't know what we would consider those, and so I haven't colored them in. So there's a bunch of those gap water rights, and so 1908 comes in right about here. I think this 1908 is just prior to the 1908 right from Utah Lake, so it's a gap right. And then these rights, 1915 to 1926, these are gap rights. They are later than the secondary, but earlier than the tertiary water rights. And then these rights on the lower Jordan River have priorities that correspond with the Deer Creek Jordanelle type water rights. So I think the idea that I want you to start thinking towards is that if Deer Creek can, or Jordanelle can interfere with Utah Lake under a 1945 or a 1971 priority, then it would seem fair that a water right on the Jordan River that had an earlier priority could also call water from Utah Lake. So in other words, when Utah Lake gets above that conversion line, if upper users with later priority are able to store, then Jordan River water rights with later priorities, I would think would have a call on Utah Lake if there wasn't water available, at least if we were going to be consistent about it. So that, yeah.
Given what you just said, how do you keep this limited to the lower Jordan?
As opposed to above Utah Lake, is that what you mean?
I thought I heard you just say the lower users may have a call on water above Utah Lake. Is that what I heard you say? If so, it sounds like a much bigger issue than just the lower Jordan.
Right. And that's part of the reason why I invited the Provo River and the Spanish Fork River people here, is because there could be, depending on how this comes out, there could be impacts that are greater than just the lower Jordan River. Yeah, I agree with that. All right, you guys are probably getting tired of hearing me, but I'm not tired of talking. I can do this all day. Okay, just to explain a few other features of this priority schedule that we've got. I talked about the 2 chunks of water that Jordan Valley moved out. That's what reduced our red line a little bit. I've highlighted them in red. It's this right down here and this right up here. There's another little change that's just minuscule that was moved out as well that I've identified. But so I've summed it up. It's all in this table. And again, this table is what produced the values for this graph right here. All right, moving down, I was here. I'm going to go here now. I told you how I produced that red line. This is how I produced the green line, which is based on the acres. And so I've done the same thing, except for I've done it a little bit differently. Here's our surplus canal water rights. Color codes are the same, but rather than showing CFS amounts, I've showed the acre amounts that are in the PDs. And though there are categories 2A, 2B, I've got them listed up there. If you're familiar with how that works, you'll know what that means. We've got the volume, the total volumes. This little chart converts that to a flow rate. I won't go through it all. Then I do the same thing with the lower Jordan water rights. So the first one was surplus canal. This is the lower Jordan. I go through the same process, convert it to an acre foot or to a flow rate. And that gives me our green line on that first graph. One thing I should point out, though, is that most of these water rights on the lower Jordan side have not been adjudicated yet. They have not been published in a proposed determination. And so we don't have these crazy categories. I don't know if we're going to end up with crazy categories or not, but most of these water rights are still to be adjudicated in the near future, I guess. And so that's why the charts look a little bit differently, as these water rights are defined a little bit differently as a result of the fact that the adjudication has only covered half of them up to now. All right. Again, this gives us our green line. Where else do I want to go? Okay. This priority schedule shows our upper Jordan River. The previous two showed the lower Jordan. This shows the upper, and also tributary water rights in Salt Lake Valley. These are the canyon rights. Now, what I did not show is any pre-statutory canyon rights. My assumption is that the pre-statutory water rights do not interact on a priority basis with the Jordan River. And the reason why I think that is because when the pioneers came into the valley, what did they develop first? They developed these side canyons. It was the best water, and it was at the elevations that they needed it. And then it wasn't until later that they started developing the Jordan River water. So I can't see any way possible that these pre-statutory tributary water rights could ever interfere with Jordan River water rights. That's my assumption. If someone wants to do a bunch of research and prove me wrong on that, then that would be a travesty, because it seems like it just seems obvious to me. The pioneers came in, they developed the water first that they developed first, and so in a priority system, they ought to have it first. But at some point, some of these upper lakes started to be developed, and we approved applications to appropriate, and so I've added those on there. I've just added the water rights that are later than 1903, and most of these are, you know, some of these small lakes that we've got up in the mountains, and I won't go through all of them. And then there are some Jordan River water rights. These right here and this right here, these are actually the water rights that I mentioned in the very beginning on the first slide when I talked about some water rights on the upper Jordan that we wanted to really codify how they were to be administered, because we weren't sure that it had been done the same way throughout the years. But I think I think the underlying theory is, though, that they ought to not be, if you've got a 1912 or 1918 water right on the Jordan River, and there's a 1945 or a 1971 water right on the Provo River that's diverting, it wouldn't be fair to cut these guys off when the later guys were diverting. You know what I'm saying? It's a priority system that we're trying to bring together. All right. I'll just hit this briefly. These are some other water rights above Utah Lake. I've identified some Provo River water rights and Spanish Fork River water rights, American Fork, Spring Creek. Again, these are water rights that are after 1903. And I think as we look bigger picture, we may need to consider how they fit into everything. But I don't think that's the purpose of this meeting. I only put this there for you to think about. I showed this before. Here's the snow decree for John. You can go, it's scan documents. I'm going to have to go back. Oh, it opened it. At any rate, I'll probably go back to my slideshow. I've only got one slide left, and somehow it made it on my paper, but it did not make it into my presentation. So let me just tell you what it says. I'm talking about the roadmap forward. Where do we go from here? What do we expect from you? I think what we're thinking is we haven't proposed any policy today. We've given you some basic ideas. We've gone over hydrology. We've gone over water rights. But we want your comments, and I think we're thinking a 90-day comment period, Boyd. Is that right? So that would be March 2nd of 2020 that we'd want to have your comments. And the idea is that we would then begin developing a policy to to distribute water on the Jordan River in conjunction with Utah Lake, upper, lower, and tributaries. But we want your comments. We will review those, start developing a policy, and then we get to do this again, you guys. Have another meeting where we propose a policy, and then we'll probably send that out for comment as well and go through that sort of iterative process. I already mentioned conveyance losses. We will probably be soliciting something in the form of a water user's claim, I would think, to help quantify conveyance losses. And then the last bullet I've got on there is perhaps there are other basin-wide considerations as the adjudication moves forward and as we consider the entire basin as a whole. But again, we're just focused on the Jordan River here. All right. Any questions? Okay, we got a question right here from Nathan.
Jared, thank you for the presentation. Are there any specific issues that you would particularly appreciate comments from the public on?
Yeah, well, I'll just tell you what I kind of expect, and that is that people would look at their own water rights and how they fit in and what the consequences might be, and perhaps some proposed ways to administer those in a priority system. I know there is also interest in using water from the Jordan River for environmental flows. And so if that's your interest, I would appreciate comments on how you think that ought to work. But I think it would need to work within the priority system. So I think it's going to just be specific to what your interests are. This is your time to represent your interests to the state so that we can consider them as we try and put all the pieces together and make it work. Okay.
Alan Packard with Jordan Valley. Jared, does the division expect that after the Jordan River plan has been put together that you'll have to revisit the Utah Lake operating plan and perhaps amend that plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a possibility that would happen, but I don't think we're committing to do that. But I think it's probably something we got to at least consider doing. Yeah, let's see. We got some questions back here. Where's my mic?
I've got it.
Okay, John.
So, yeah, I'll give it to Scott after. So given that there are still claims being, a couple comments and a question. Given that there are claims still being litigated in the PDs or in the general adjudication, what's the status of this going to be? Is it going to be interim? Which bleeds into Alan's question. The Utah Lake Management Plan, as I understand it, is an interim management plan. It's not a final agency action. Where are we? What statutory process are we under in this process? I mean, I'm thinking if an interim policy can become basically the law of the river de facto, where's the due process here? Are we going to have a chance to challenge it if we don't like it? We probably ought to get into the nitty-gritty of the model at some point. What is this? Where's the statutory authority for the state engineer? Is it a final agency action? What's happening here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you want to answer that?
Hi, I'm Sarah Schechter. I'm with the AG's office, and I'm these guys' lawyer. The Utah Management Plan, Utah Lake Management Plan, and this plan would both be informal policy decisions. And I don't want to give away too much, but basically that means that they are not final agency actions. This is not an adjudicative proceeding. These are the policies of the state engineer. And I know that the lawyers in this room know that that means that they don't carry the same force of law that a final agency action or an adjudicative proceeding does have. However, as John mentioned, in some sense, they do become the de facto law of the river, which is why I think we felt that doing this process where Jared comes to you, explains what we're trying to achieve, asks for your comments, and then we will ultimately share the plan and hopefully get comments again so that we can come up with the best policy possible. We are hoping to alleviate some of those concerns because we would prefer to have buy-in from the entire Jordan River community.
Yeah, because the other alternative is what? We go through
A formal adjudication, well, informal adjudication, but it would be as codified under the rules that govern the Division of Water Rights and the statute. So we could do it that way, but we feel that, I think, we've gone back and forth as a group, and we really felt that this process actually offered the greatest chance for participation and for it to be a totally iterative process. So that's where we ended up. And we also know that conditions do change, that in 30 years we may be where we were, compared to 1992. Now we're here. In 25, 30 years, we may be in another place where we need to relook at all of this again. And in some sense, it's much easier to do that when we've come up with a policy document like the plans that we've arrived at.
Okay.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks for the presentation. This was very informative. I appreciate it. Question, just so my notes are correct, you're looking at sort of the system-wide priority scheme. Is that right? That's safe to say? How does this affect groundwater rights in the valley? I mean, my understanding is that they haven't been administered on a priority basis to date. Where are we on that?
Yeah, that's a real tough one. There is an interaction between groundwater and surface water, but we've never, ever, as far as I know, tried to conjunctively distribute groundwater and surface water, and I'm not imagining that is something that we want to do. So it's one of those things where I don't think that's where we're going. Would be my opinion.
All right, I guess on that basis then, let me ask this question. So if we're looking at this on a wholesale basis, and I know your indication was that it's primarily focused on the Jordan River itself. However, if you're above Utah Lake, you should pay attention. Is that? So let's assume for a second I'm a lower Jordan River right holder. Do I have a priority call on surface water at the highest reaches of the tributaries to Utah Lake? And I'm not asking this to be chippy or anything like that. I'm just trying to. And I appreciate that you've asked for public comment, and to the extent we're going to that I'll submit comments. I just want to make sure that I understand the issues, and so that's why I'm trying to frame it a bit. So.
I think the way we would understand a hydrologic system is that it's all connected from the bottom to the top, and that if we were to manage it that way rather than in silos, that would be the case. We've managed it in silos, and so that historically that hasn't been the practice. But on a theoretical and general basis, I would say yes.
Okay, so is the silo approach dead?
No, I don't think so. I think, as I said, we didn't propose a policy today because we wanted to get your comments. I suppose everyone could say, hey, this silo approach works great. Let's stick with it. What are you doing, state engineer? Go back to your office and shut the door. And I would love that, actually.
Well, I have the first book of 59 of of Area 59. It's the PD 59-1, 1975, and in there are a number of Duck Club and other rights that have priority dates. I'm just sort of picking one. 1876 here for Rudy Reclamation. And so my question then becomes, would Rudy Reclamation have a call on surface water, say, at the top of the Spanish Fork drainage? I don't know, put a label on it, Indianola.
Let me answer that from a practical standpoint. And from a practical standpoint, I think it's no. And the reason why is because I think there is enough water in the Jordan River to satisfy all those water rights on the lower Jordan River, at least let's say the earlier priority water rights. I think where the question becomes is as you look into the very latest lower Jordan water rights, and if the hydrograph goes below that red line that I've got here, then the question becomes, where does their call extend? But there's a lot of practical implications, and one of those is that to get below this red line, it's going to be late in the summer. And if you look at later priority water rights, like on the Provo and the Spanish Fork, they are already cut off practically because they're later priority water rights and the supply is not there. So I don't think we're going to be in a situation where we're looking at the Jordan River and cutting off people on tributaries upstream, because I think the natural system will take care of that. So that's from a practical standpoint, I think where we're at. Now, again, as you get into those very later priority dates, I think the issue becomes Utah Lake. Some of the water in Utah Lake is dedicated to water holders in Utah Lake, but you get above that green line and you're saying, hey, this is kind of extra water. And so I think perhaps we would need to be in that situation with Utah Lake before we could even consider satisfying lower Jordan River water rights with a call upstream.
Great, thanks. And if you'll humor me with one last one, let's take Utah Lake then out of the picture and stay with Rudy Reclamation, 1878, Lower Jordan Right. Let's go below Utah Lake and into one of the canyon streams, and assume for a second that you're a first surplus or second surplus right holder on Little Cottonwood Creek, which has a priority date of in the 1880s. Then, taking Utah Lake out of the picture based on what you've said, now let's talk about, does this lower Jordan user have a call on Little Cottonwood Creek water based on priority?
From a practical standpoint, I would say no, because there's going to be enough water to satisfy those lower Jordan water rights. Any way I look at it, I can't see a situation where pre-statutory water rights on these canyons could ever be subject to a call from the Jordan River. I don't think the hydrology would ever merit that happening.
Okay. Thank you very much for your help. Appreciate it.
Jared, I had a question about a comment you made concerning the status of the adjudication of water rights on the Jordan River. Did you say there are still some lower Jordan water rights that are not included in any proposed determination at this point, or did I miss?
No, that's correct. When we did the adjudication, we looked at the water rights from the surplus canal. As you know, we were doing the 59 area, but not the 57 area. Some of the major water rights on the Jordan River side of the lower Jordan, we considered at that time to be in the 57 area. So that would be like Wildlife's water right, New State, Burnham Duck Clubs. Those are the three main ones, and they're big. They represent, tens of thousands of acres, or 10,000 or something like that. And so those we are going to be picking up here in an addendum to the proposed determination.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Boyd, do you want to wrap it up, or do you want me to? Oh, John's got another one.
What are we commenting on exactly? Mostly I've seen modeling and all the inputs into the model, but there's no formal, and then the presentation as well. It seems like at this point it's more, should we have a model? If there is one, here's what it ought to look like, but there's nothing out there yet that formally responding to, right?
Right. So what are you responding to? I guess recommendations on how we ought to administer this going forward. Maybe the recommendation is keep the silos where they're at. Maybe the recommendation is, there ought to be a hard line at Utah Lake during the winter, there's some real practical things. Another thing you may want to comment on, I talked about these primary and secondary and tertiary water rights, and then I had all these in-between rights. At some point, I think we're going to need to set some hard lines and categorize everything as one of those three types of right, so that we know how they interact with Utah Lake. But right now there's sort of a no man's land. So one of the things you might comment on is where to draw those lines between primary and secondary, and between secondary and tertiary. Yes, we'll put the presentation online and the slideshow, and I showed you where to access the model as well, and so, I mean, the other thing that you can comment on is if there are some other water rights that really need to be considered that we've missed in our analysis, let us know so that we can understand those as well. I tried to pick up the ones that I thought were relevant, but I mean, this is a big valley, and I only worked in the regional office here for like 2 years, and that wasn't nearly enough time to cover everything I needed to cover.
May I make one more comment? Some rumbling I'm hearing back here. 90 days is probably not sufficient for issues that are of such magnitude, particularly with the legislature in session and just ending around that time. We don't think 90 days is enough time.
Okay. What do you think, Boyd? The reason I like 90 days is because for the next 90 days I'm busy, but then after that I'm not. My distribution meetings are done. But I mean, I'm fine with pushing it back. What are your thoughts, Boyd?
I know my seat feels like I've been sitting for 90 days, so it must be about over. I think what we want is, we don't want final answers in 90 days. We want the best input you can provide back based on what we've given you today in 90 days. We'll look at that and then decide what the next step is moving along. We're not gonna put a plan together starting in 90 days. That's not the process we're in. We're in a process of trying to have all of you understand what we understand. And if we've missed something, we'd like to hear about what you know and what you think we missed in 90 days. And then we'll move to the next step. Is that helpful? I understand it's a hard time of year, and I'm probably not going to look at anything before then either. So, yes.
I think to my earlier point about some of the legislative proposals that have already been developed around water banking and the watershed councils and so forth, I would certainly ask that at the end of the legislative session that whatever outcome of those happens, that ought to really be a consideration. So if the time period is not extended, certainly consideration from those legislative matters ought to be factored in.
There'll be legislative matters this year, and there'll be legislative matters every
Always.
year, and we'll be factoring them in forever, yeah.
For sure.
Anything else? Thank you very much for your patience. This was a lot of material. I know it's a lot to digest, and I just suggest as you have time, you look at it and think about it. I'll get more questions. I thought I got away from that, but
This is just housekeeping, Boyd, sorry. Is the presentation online already?
I don't believe it is, but we'll get it up by tomorrow, and then we'll have a link. I was thinking we ought to put a link directly to the model on that. We'll put up a page for the meeting that'll have the presentation, a link straight to the model, so it'll be easy to get to all the information. And the audio? Yeah. Yeah, all that stuff.
I had the same comment about presentation materials, and since we represent a specific Jordan River organization, it might be valuable even to have you come and give a presentation. I don't know how we might go about scheduling that with our governing board and the Jordan River Commission, but I think this will be of great interest to our board members across 3 counties and 16 cities.
If I was guessing, Jared's going to be giving this presentation a couple times here.
Thank you.
So we'd be happy to help theirs. Anything else? Thank you very much for your time.